the typical questions or maybe issues that people have? Let's say they've worked with another kind of operator and now they're moving over to Vitess. Are there any things in terms of onboarding or typical frequently asked questions that you seem to find?
The main theme over there is actually the sharding. So I actually prepared this because we have sharding stance over here, sharding widely and shard often. Because of the design of our data, it becomes very cluttered and big over a time, especially when you start scaling. You actually have to break it up in smaller pieces, and that's how it's manageable, and that's how all these companies actually solved their scaling problems. And that's, if you're actually scaling to a certain point, you need to, if you have the sharding in the mindset to come to that, that's where. And the questions actually, in generally, from my knowledge, from my short knowledge, is on, one is how to migrate, basically how to take your existing data to Vitess, and two is prepare yourself how to shard, because then you're actually breaking up your data in smaller pieces by a logic, and that logic you have to actually adapt it to your application. What is the, it depends on a company. It could be clicks, like you're actually receiving. It could be geo distribution. It could be regions. From what I know, it could be a customer distribution. In Slack's case, was the each workspace, like every workspace was different, and some of them were very large, some of them were very small, and then you actually create hot points if you actually put all the data in, and the others suffer. And this happened in our initial cloud migration also, which they called a busy neighbor. While your neighbor is busy consuming all the resources, there's nothing left for you, right? And this is the same thing in the data. If you don't actually split up properly, then you actually have a problem. This is on the Vitess side under reference. There's a nice read about sharding. I actually recommend reading this. Basically, this is how the Vitess mindset of sharding that actually has basically in the replicas, and then actually doing that. There are some advanced topics in the Vitess that could be a little confusing for people who are not actually familiar with sharding. There is also resharding. You actually can put your data in and then redistribute later on, and that is more advanced thing to do. If or you actually put your data in and then split up, or you put sharded data into the correct shards and then start serving your data. And there are different techniques for that. One of which I mentioned is a V replication, is a very advanced replication. You can actually drive and replicate and do a cutover. So basically, these are the techniques that Vitess had already implemented and solved the problems of scalability issues in most cases. What are the drawbacks? I want to actually ask this question myself. Drawbacks are nothing is drop-in replacement, right? So there's some assembly required, and to get the right recipe out, right? So basically, you actually have to plan accordingly. You don't go out to, whether it's operator or not operator, or Helm charts, or you don't go out and just go to production with your data. You need to actually plan accordingly, and that's what my best recommendation is, to test out and basically run through your workflow, how you would do things in normal data store, and do that on Vitess, using Vitess, and then think about doing the Kubernetes approach also after that. And the Kubernetes is also evolving. It's Vitess is evolving. Things change, so backwards compatibility is a challenge at some points. And also I also always like to highlight one thing. one thing that is most important for your data is security. So security and compliance, make sure that your data is secure. So
it's funny that you mentioned that, Alkin, as well, is because when we talk about these things like security and other issues as well, is that it seems it's frequently something that's added much later in the story and not included in the beginning because it's boring. It's like feeling like you're doing police work or that you're restricting people's freedom. But how do you, as someone also who kind of works in developer relations, how do you sort of strike that balance between, fun freedom, but then also security and best practices with that?
So basically, there are some surrounding tools that we use, and each of those components, like in this case, it's a Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes, you need to actually follow the security procedures over there, and that's what it is, and they're your data store. Same thing with MySQL or any other data store. You need to actually follow their best practices first before you come into that point. But historically speaking, if you're going into this route, you already have some sort of a know-how in these best practices. So outside of, let's take the Kubernetes and Vitess outside of this conversation. If you were to ask me, what should I do as a best practice in MySQL, there is actually a list of things that you need to do because that's the best practice for that data store. Mm-hmm. It would be similar, but slightly different in Postgres or MongoDB. You would actually have to go through those steps, make sure that your backend data store already compliant with that, and you carry that with you. Anything you add, you check those gaps, whether it's actually able to do that or it's compliant with that. There is a lot of moving parts into that, right? Your security certificates, your encryption keys, your encryption vault, your plugins to those vaults. There's a lot of moving parts depending on where you are. You need to make sure those each component are actually compliant first, and then they actually work together. So that is a little bit of a challenge, but it's doable, and that's why we say test first, deploy later. So it needs to be tested.
Yeah, of course. Then some people say, no, when I'm in production, that's what I'm testing. But it's like, no.
Well, you test in production after you go live, but that's easier than basically migrating in production. So that would be a slightly different. So we're talking about migrating into a different technology or a different topology than testing in production. So there's always going to be test in production.